What's going on there, YouTube? Welcome back to another comic book video. Okay, so we're going to continue our coverage over the X-Men, but now we have reached a point where we are beginning to wind down our coverage over the X-Men. What I mean is that we are about to jump into the next X-Men crossover that we have to talk about, and that will be the Executioner song. Now, this was a massive crossover that Marvel did right after Jim Lee had left. Let me explain. So when it came to the X-Men in the early 1990s, they were really popular. You had a lot of different X titles: X-Factor, X-Force, Excalibur, but you had two X-Men books. And the reason why, because the original X-Factor team had rejoined the X-Men. When that happened, well, Charles had 14 different X-Men at his house. He said, you know what? I can go ahead and put you guys in two different teams, Gold Team and Blue Team. Now, if you read Uncanny X-Men, you were following Storm Team, better known as Gold Team. But if you're reading a book called just X-Men, well, you were following the Blue Team that was being led by Cyclops. Two different teams. Now, here's a big thing though. When it came to the X-Men book, it was actually launched by Jim Lee and Chris Claremont. But after the first 3 issues, Chris left, and then Jim Lee was able to take over the book as writer and artist. But after issue number 11, he also left to go help create Image Comics. And so it left the door open for somebody else to come in and write the X-Men. And that was Fabian Nicieza. And I really hope I pronounced his last name correctly. I feel like I always just mess up his last name. But for Fabian, he was the new writer of the X-Men, the main writer now. He did write a few X-Men stories in the past before this point. Prime example is Kings of Pain and also Shattershot. But this is his time to take over completely. And now the X-Men were under his control. Now for Fabian, he was beginning to kind of lay down the groundwork of the idea of the father of Charles Xavier having a dark secret. And this leads into the Xavier File. Now, before we are able to actually jump into the dark secrets of Charles Xavier's father, but also the Xavier File, I kind of want to jump over to X-Men issue number 12, the opening pages for today's story arc, because we actually pick up with a character known as Carter Riking. Now, Carter Riking has been living in a hospital called the Riking Hospital. It was named after his father. Now, for Carter, we do learn that he is a mutant, and he has the ability to, well, generate plasma inside his body, but he needs special kind of gear if he wants to shoot that plasma as some kind of energy blast. Now, for Carter, we do learn that he has been locked up in this hospital for many years, and sometimes he'll try to escape, but usually he is unable to escape because the staff is there to shut him down when he tries to escape. But now they're wondering why this last time he went so crazy powerful, like what actually set him off. And we do learn that his father, Alexander Riking, had just died, and Carter had just learned that his father had just died. Now here's the catch. Alexander used to work very close to Brian Xavier, the father of Charles Xavier. But now we jump over to the X-Men. Now really, the next few pages are just establishing a few things. Like for example, the whole idea that Rogue and Gambit do have feelings for one another. But the big problem is that, well, Rogue cannot be touched. But for Gambit, he's really trying his best to be with her. Also, let's not forget that in a previous story arc, we had just learned that Gambit was married. Now, in his defense, he did run away from his wife as a way to protect her, and he thought he could never go back to her. But also, in that previous story arc, his previous wife had died. And so for Gambit, it's kind of like, listen, I'm technically single again, which means that you and me, Rogue, can possibly be together now. But again, the big problem is they cannot touch because of Rogue's powers. We are also setting up the idea that Psylock is not going to be here for this story arc. And the reason why, because she has to go see her brother over in Great Britain, which means that once we go over to Excalibur, we're going to see Psylock teaming up with the Excalibur team down the road. And Beast is going to be the one to drive her over to the airport. Now, as they drive off, we're also establishing that Cyclops is actually thinking about cheating on Jean Grey with Psylock. Like, if you saw my lives the last few weeks, y'all should know that I'm not really the biggest fan of Cyclops, and this is another reason why. Because this man is actually thinking of possibly leaving Jean Grey for Psylock. But now we jump over to Jubilee, who's going through a Danger Room session. Now, this story arc also reminds us that, well, Jubilee may not be a well-established member of the X-Men, because in an earlier story arc where you have the X-Men team up with Ghost Rider, you have Beast say like, hey, Jubilee is not an X-Men yet. She's not covered in our insurance plan. And so we're kind of left to believe that even though Jubilee has been on a lot of missions, she's not an established member of the team just yet. But you do have Charles putting her through a Danger Room session. But in the middle of that session, you have Wolverine appear, very upset at Charles Xavier because he just found the Xavier File, and he believes that that file may have connections to his past. And let's not forget that the 1990s, Marvel was trying their best to establish the actual origin of Wolverine. Now, this is where we dive into the Xavier File, but not completely here. So for the Xavier File, we do learn that it's information about Brian Xavier, the father of Charles Xavier. But apparently this information takes place before Charles was born, but after Charles was born as well. But here's the big problem though. Charles has not been able to actually dive deep through all the different pieces of the file yet. But for Wolverine, while using the computer at the school of Charles Xavier, he found the Xavier File. And to him, he feels like the Xavier File may have some connections over to his past. And so he's kind of upset that Charles did not hand over the Xavier File. But for Xavier, Charles Xavier, he's kind of like, dude, I have not gone through that file properly yet to kind of figure out what is it all about. All I know is that it contains information about my father. Until I am able to actually sit down and go through it, I can't really give it over to you. And really, we're unable to build connections from my father's past to your past. Now, I want to jump back over to Carter because we do establish that Carter is able to finally escape from the hospital. And this time, when he does escape, he kills all the different staff members who were there trying to contain him. But his goal now is to make sure that his father's secret and other people who had worked with him, their secrets are also be released to the rest of the world, to the public. But also want to make sure that Charles Xavier knows the actual past of his father. Now, I want to jump over to Charles Xavier and Wolverine for a brief moment. Here's the reason why. So for Charles Xavier, he tells us that he only received the Xavier File 6 weeks ago. The problem is that he has no idea who gave him the file in the first place. Now, he was able to kind of look through some pieces of the information in the file, and he did learn that apparently his father worked for the government, but apparently they were studying genetic mutation. Of course, we're talking about mutants. Now, when it came to Charles' father, he died when Charles was 9 years old. But apparently Brian died in an accident at a facility called Alamogordo. And so for Charles Xavier, if they want any kind of information, they have to go there maybe. But while talking to Wolverine, he sees a news update about the funeral for Alexander Riking. And Charles remembers Alexander because he worked very close to his father, Brian Xavier. Now, I want to jump over to Charles Xavier. And you have Charles Xavier going over to the funeral for Alexander Riking. Now, for Charles, he has not seen Alexander Riking since he was 9 years old after his father had died. But for Charles, This is him just trying to hopefully find any kind of piece of information about his father and his past. But here's the problem. Carter arrives. Now, for Carter, like I said earlier, he's trying to establish with the public that his father, Alexander, was not a good man, that Alexander was actually a very bad man. Now, once you have Carter arrive, you have Charles being able to connect his mind to Carter's mind, where you have Carter begin to have talks with Charles in their minds. And we do learn that Carter was the one who sent Charles Xavier the file, the Xavier file. And the reason why, because Carter said, Xavier, you should want to know about your father's past. And let me tell you right now, your father and my father had worked together. Now for Charles, he's right. He wants to know more about his father's past. But he also tells Carter, we're not going to get any kind of piece of information about your father here at his grave. Like, we have to go somewhere else. And for Carter, he knows where to go. The Alamogordo facility, the same place where Brian Xavier had his accident that had apparently killed him. But for Carter, he said, it all began there. It all ended there for me as well. And so you have Carter pick up Charles and they fly away. Now, with Charles Xavier being taken away by Carter, you then have Val Cooper call up the X-Men to inform them what had happened. Now, remember, Val Cooper works for the government, and really, she has her own X team, and that would be X Factor. And so it's her saying like, hey guys, listen, your guy, Charles, was just taken away by this Carter Riking guy. Now, for the X-Men, they already know where Carter had taken Charles to. Alamogordo. And so you have the X-Men about to head over there right now. Now for Val, she cannot understand why in the world that Carter would take Charles there. And you have the X-Men say like, listen, the reason why? Because Charles' father used to work there and so did Alexander Riking. But apparently there could be more information behind that place. Now for Val, she said, listen, I work for the government. And even with that kind of power, I don't have any kind of information about that facility, which means that it had to go deep into the government where she does not have the clearance to look at those kind of files. Either way, you do have the X-Men begin to head over there to go save their boss, Charles Xavier. Now, this is where I want you guys to kind of jump back to our previous X-Men video. Here's the reason why. So, in our previous X-Men video, we had actually talked about Alexander Riking before, because remember, we had a story where you had the X-Men fighting against Mojo in the Mojoverse. We had a backup story where you had Maverick go after Alexander Riking, and you had Maverick being able to kill off Alexander Riking. And so the death of Alexander is all Maverick's fault, which then led to Carter being able to finally break free from Riking Hospital. So now you should know what actually happened to Alexander Riking, how he died. It was back in our last video when we covered that backup story that involved Maverick. But getting back on track, we do jump over to X-Men issue number 13. Now, with the 13th issue, we do learn that Carter and also Charles Xavier had arrived at the Alamogordo facility. Now, like I said earlier, this facility has been abandoned for years. I'm talking about it's been quiet for a very long time, ever since the incident that had killed Charles Xavier's father, Brian. Now, here's the catch. You see, we had learned in the past that, well, Brian Xavier had died by the hands of Kurt Marco, the father to the Juggernaut, the stepfather to Charles Xavier. But you have Carter saying, what if I tell you, when it came to your father's death, there's actually more to it? Like, what if it was a cover-up, possibly? Now, you do have Carter being able to blast down a wall that shows a hidden staircase that leads into another part of the facility that was never discovered by the public. And so it's Carter saying, our family secrets are down there. If we go down there, we should be able to learn more about our father's past. Now, while you have Charles and also Carter going deep into the actual facility, the X-Men had arrived to hopefully look for their professor. Now, I want to focus more on Wolverine and Rogue because you have Rogue being very concerned for Wolverine. Now, for Logan, he's kind of like, listen, I don't need your help. I don't need your support. But for Rogue, it's more of like, yes, you do, because out of everybody here, she's the best person who kind of knows what Wolverine is going through. Because remember, in the 1990s, like I said earlier, they were trying to establish the actual origin of Wolverine. But they kept going back and forth telling us that some things were actually true about Logan and some things weren't. And so for Logan, it was kind of messing with his mind. And so for Rogue, she says she understands what it's like to have your mind going all different kinds of directions, because with her ability being able to absorb other people's powers, but also their memories as well, for Rogue, she had a moment in time where she was battling against other personas in her mind. For example, Carol Danvers, when Carol Danvers' persona was able to actually take over the body of Rogue for a short period of time. Either way, it does show that Wolverine and Rogue are really close to one another, and not really in a romantic kind of way, kind of like big brother to little sister or possibly father to daughter. Now, I want to jump back over to the X Mansion, and the reason why, because we're going to pick up with Jubilee. Now, you have Jubilee being left behind at the X Mansion, but she realized that somebody is trying to call the X Mansion, and that would be Cannonball. Now, remember, Cannonball is working with X-Force. Now, for Charles Xavier and the X-Men, they don't really like X-Force because X-Force is, well, a very extreme group of characters who are not afraid to kill people. And for Charles, that is never okay. But Cannonball was apparently calling Charles for some kind of strange reason. Now, you would think he'll leave a message behind for Jubilee to give to Charles. But he says, no, I'll just call back later, and hangs up just like that. Now, there are two characters I do want to talk about that we have not talked about in a very long time, really, when it comes to our coverage over the X-Men. That'll be Firefist and also Skid. Now, remember, Firefist and Skid were technically trainees for the original X Factor team, but also after they had left X Factor, they kind of joined the New Mutants for a very short period of time. But then they were kind of forced to join the Mutant Liberation Front that's being led by Strife. And remember, when it comes to that group, they're telling the public that they're going around attacking different government facilities as a way to make sure the government will not try to go after the mutants or hold mutants against their wills. Now, we also learned that Strife has some other plans down the road, but he also looks just like Cable. Now, with all that information, he had Firefist and Skid go get a piece of art that kind of shows the face of Apocalypse. And apparently for Strife, it's time for him to get his revenge against get his revenge against Apocalypse for what he has done to him in the past. Now, the ending of this book does wrap up very quickly here as we jump back over to the X-Men fighting against Carter Riking. Now, like I said earlier, for Carter Riking, he does have the ability to generate plasma energy. But here's the big catch though. He needs a special kind of mechanism that really helps him channel that power correctly. But if he does not have that special kind of mechanism around him, well, unfortunately, he will not be able to properly shoot the energy as a blast towards his foes. And so for the X-Men, while you have the X-Men battling against him, Cyclops is able to damage that special mechanism. And so Carter is no longer able to properly shoot his energy blast. And it does cause a small explosion in the facility, knocking him out. Now for Logan, he still wants answers from Carter, but you have Charles Xavier say, listen, we're not going to get any kind of information here from this place because this place is completely dead. If we want to be able to get any kind of piece of information about your past or my father's past, we have to go to other places where my father had possibly lived to hopefully get the right things we need to know about what he was working on, and also maybe more secrets of Logan's past. But this is where we are going to end today's comic book video. So please leave me a like down below and subscribe. But guys, see y'all next time. Later.